It's one of the most difficult questions a parent, a doctor, or even a young person has to grapple with. When is it the right move to prescribe an antidepressant to someone who's not yet an adult? The debate around this is, well, it's intense, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
So that's the big question we're diving into. Are these medications a lifeline for youth mental health, or are they a risky intervention we should be more cautious about? You hear strong opinions from all sides, but today we're going to cut through the noise and look directly at the evidence.
Here's the situation. For well over a decade, the number of antidepressant prescriptions for young people has been climbing in places like the US and Europe. But even with that trend, the whole practice is still incredibly controversial.
To try and get the clearest answer possible, we're digging into something called a meta-review. Now, you can think of this as a study of studies. Instead of just looking at one piece of research, it pulls together the results from a whole bunch of different trials. And why is that so powerful? Because it helps smooth out any weird results and shows us the patterns that are most reliable.
Okay, so before we get into what they found, we need to make sure we're all speaking the same language as the scientists. They measure the impact of these drugs using 3 very specific terms, and getting these down is really the key to understanding the results.
First up, we've got efficacy. This is the most basic question of all, right? Does the drug actually do what it's supposed to do? To figure this out, scientists compare it against a placebo, a sugar pill. The drug has to work way better than that placebo to be considered effective.
Next, there's tolerability, and this is super practical. It's not just about listing side effects, it's about whether those side effects are so bad that people actually stop taking the medicine. It's kind of like a real-world test of how manageable a drug is day to day.
And finally, the most serious one, suicidality. This is obviously a huge concern. Researchers were looking very closely for any evidence that these drugs either increased or maybe even decreased the risk of suicidal thoughts or actions in kids and teens.
All right, so with those terms in our back pocket, let's get to the good stuff. What did this huge review actually find? Which of these drugs worked, and for what? The answers are surprisingly specific.
So this is where it gets really interesting. It's not just a simple yes or no. For major depression, only one drug, fluoxetine, was clearly better than a placebo. For anxiety disorders, a couple of others stood out. And for OCD, 2 different drugs showed a real effect. But then look at the bottom row. For conditions like PTSD, the review found that no antidepressant worked better than a sugar pill. So the big takeaway here is that effectiveness is all about the specific drug for the specific condition. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all.
But hold on, because efficacy is only half the story, right? A drug can work, but we also have to ask at what cost. So now we have to flip the coin over and look at the risks that the researchers found.
This quote, "This is the official black box warning that the FDA makes companies put on these drugs. It's pretty blunt, and it's a stark reminder of the most serious risk. It says flat out that in short studies, these medications were linked to an increase in suicidal thoughts and behaviors."
But, and this is so important, the meta-review discovered that the risk isn't the same across the board. When you really dig into the data from all those studies, a much more detailed and nuanced picture starts to form. Not all of these drugs carry the same risk.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. The review found that one drug, when used for depression, and another, when used for anxiety, were actually linked to a significantly increased risk. But then, get this, sertraline, when used for anxiety, was associated with a reduced risk. I mean, wow, that's a powerful finding that really complicates that simple black box warning.
And what about tolerability, those side effects that make people stop taking the medicine? Well, for major depression, 3 drugs really stood out. More kids and teens stopped taking these 3 compared to the placebo, which tells us their side effects were just harder to handle.
Okay, so let's zoom out now and look at the whole picture. Because even with all this data, the researchers themselves were quick to say, hey, be careful. They pointed out some really important limitations in the evidence that we absolutely need to keep in mind.
For one thing, most of these studies were super short. We're talking just a few months. That means we have almost no solid data on the long-term effects on things like a young person's growth and development. Plus, the quality of the original studies was all over the place. And you always have to wonder about potential bias, since many of these trials are funded by the very companies that make the drugs.
The researchers also ran into something called the placebo response, and it's especially strong in young people. A whole lot of patients start to feel better even when they're just taking a sugar pill. Now, that doesn't mean their struggles aren't real, not at all. It just shows that lots of things can help someone get better, which makes it even harder to figure out how much of the improvement is actually from the drug itself.
So, what's the final takeaway from all of this? Well, the most important point is that there isn't one. The evidence doesn't give us a simple yes or no.
What it does is support using some drugs for some kids with some conditions. But it also shines a bright light on some very real risks and some huge gaps in our knowledge, especially when it comes to the long term.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? The science can't give us a simple answer because there isn't one to be had. What it gives us instead is a roadmap for a very difficult, very personal conversation. A conversation about weighing specific benefits against specific risks and making a careful, thoughtful decision for each and every child.